Hello, everybody. My name is Phoenix, and I am once again here to talk to you about Forsaken. Today, we are going to be having another long-winded yap session about a character that's pretty near and dear to me. Anyone that's been around my channel for any length of time knows I really like John Doe. He's my killer main and my favorite character in Forsaken, although Azure has quickly climbed the ranks in my personal favorites. John Doe is a character I've talked about multiple times before, most notably on my discussing every killer in Forsaken video, but after my video doing a full character deep dive on Azure, some people had suggested I also do one for John Doe, and I was also not going to miss an opportunity to talk for an hour or so about a character that I really love, so this video will follow a similar format to that one. Most of the information I'm citing will be from the official Forsaken wiki page, which I have to give a little shout out to Lulu in my Discord for his hard work on the wiki and to anyone that contributes to it. It's definitely been a huge help for these kinds of projects, and generally it's just really fun to poke around and read up on the various character pages. As always, the timestamps will be in the description below, and without any further delay, let's get straight into the discussion. John Doe is one of the oldest killers in Forsaken, and was one of the first playable characters available during the game's initial launch on December 25th, 2024. John Doe is most commonly identified as being a zoner or a trap killer. The official wiki lists his main playstyle being a set play and a trapper, previously described as being a strategist playstyle, which I personally still feel is a good descriptor of how John Doe plays, and for good reason. His whole kit revolves around zoning survivors with his digital footprints and his corrupt energy spikes. He has a base sprint speed of 27.25 and a walk speed of 9, and as I've stated before, health doesn't really matter in this game, but his health pool sits at 2300, making him extremely difficult to kill. John Doe also has the highest damage basic M1 in the game, doing a massive 28 points of damage per hit. The trade-off is that he also has a very slow M1 windup, making his basic attacks very reactable to things like blocking and parry punching from Guest 1337. Although he's gone through some balance changes over time, I've seen a lot of varying opinions on his overall balance. He's very much the kind of character where if you asked 10 different people what they thought of John Doe's balance, you'd very likely get 10 different answers. Some people still firmly believe that he is the strongest killer in the game, only rivaled by characters like 1X who have insane potential. Others will tell you he's the weakest killer in the game, especially with the slew of map changes that have most recently come to Forsaken in the Azure update. To understand why people's views on John Doe are so volatile, let's break down the kit. Starting out with John Doe's passive abilities, he currently has two passives built into his kit. The first being Natural Malevolence. A trail of corruption follows John Doe wherever he walks. Survivors that step into this trail will be inflicted with the Corrupted status effect and also take 7 points of damage over time over the course of 3 seconds. The trail extends out behind John by about 48 studs until it begins to close in towards him as he moves around the map. The second passive is called Unstoppable, and is John's built-in way to deal with stuns. Whenever John Doe is stunned out of two very specific abilities that we will cover, those being Corrupt Energy and 404 Error, the duration of the stun is reduced down to 2 seconds. He will roar and gain speed 1 for 3 seconds, with an additional 1 second being added to this duration for every sentinel still alive in the match. The cooldown of the ability that was interrupted and triggered Unstoppable is also reduced by 50%. Now with the passives out of the way, let's talk about the main abilities. John Doe's first ability is a global aura reading called 404 Error. This ability will reveal the aura of every survivor that is not currently undetectable or invisible, and has a short windup of, by my guess, about 2.5 seconds, where his movement speed is temporarily slowed, and a map-wide audio cue can be heard by the survivor so they know when he is actively using it. Different skins can also change this sound, so survivors should always be wary and listening for sound cues that are different from the usual map ambiance if they know they're up against a John Doe. Once the ability has been used, it will reveal the aura of every detectable survivor on the map for 6 seconds. The ability has a cooldown of 20 seconds. There's not really much else to go over. It's just basically a wall hack ability, and it doesn't really need to be much else. However, it does synergize well with the rest of his kit, and has a little bit of nuance, which we'll get into here in a little bit. If this ability is interrupted by a stun, it will trigger the Unstoppable passive. John Doe's second ability is Digital Footprint. John will stomp his foot on the ground and leave a circular puddle underneath him. The puddle is fairly large, with a diameter of about 7.5 studs. John can place up to 3 of these footprints around the map. Once all 3 are placed, if he uses the ability again, it will replace the first footprint he set down. The cooldown of the ability itself is about 3 seconds. The footprints also have a fairly loud audio cue, which has a range of about 90 studs that can be heard by the survivors. The lifetime of these footprints is infinite, and they can only be removed if a survivor triggers them, or if John moves them by cycling through all 3 of his available traps. A few things happen if a survivor steps into a footprint. For the survivors, they are inflicted with the Corrupted status effect, their aura is revealed to John Doe for 10 seconds, and they can also see John Doe's aura simultaneously. Survivors are also inflicted with Slowness 2 for the same duration, and they will take a total of 19 points of damage over time. Stepping in a trap will cause it to disappear, and John will have to replace it if he so chooses. For John Doe himself, if a survivor steps into a digital footprint, along with the debuffs that they receive, John gets a speed boost of speed 1 for 10 seconds after the trap is triggered, and like I stated previously, he can see the survivor's aura for the 10-second duration. John Doe's final and arguably his most important ability that is core to his entire identity in Forsaken is Corrupt Energy. John Doe will plant his corrupted arm in the ground and unleash a wave of exactly 27 spikes. These spikes have a total lifetime of 14 seconds once they are summoned, and they cannot be removed by survivors. The ability has a cooldown of 18 seconds. The spikes can be somewhat controlled by John Doe. They will start close to him and travel outwards. However, he can curve them to create barriers around certain obstacles or to cut off areas that he wants, and they do not necessarily have to be in a straight line. The only downside to this is curving or flicking too hard can leave gaps in the spikes. They act as an impenetrable wall. As long as the John player doesn't leave any gaps in the spikes that survivors can slip through. Sometimes quickly flicking the spikes or leaving gaps isn't necessarily a bad thing, though. The spikes also do damage on a direct hit to survivors. Because they also do a very small amount of pushback, sometimes you will have interactions where the spikes will hit a survivor and push them into another spike that pops up after it. Each spike does 12 damage, but can only do up to a maximum of 48 damage, and any subsequent spikes will not inflict any damage after this point until another usage of Corrupt Energy is in play. Basically, he can only do up to a maximum of 48 damage per use of his spikes. If a survivor is directly hit with the spikes, John is granted with speed 1 for 7 seconds. Also, this is a little bit more niche, but anyone that stands on top of the spikes will be inflicted with the Corrupted status effect, which will deal 12 damage over the course of 5 seconds. I think with all of the abilities listed out, it's also important to note that as many of John's abilities inflict corruption as a status effect, survivors cannot die to corruption, no matter how low their health currently is when they are afflicted, except for in extremely niche and rare scenarios. Corruption will never bring a survivor's health lower than 1 HP. I want to preface this next section with a quick disclaimer that while I do love John Doe, any of the discussion around gameplay is purely my own opinions and thoughts formed from my own experiences within the game. With all of John Doe's abilities explained, let's talk about the actual gameplay and how his kit all works together cohesively. All of his abilities synergize well with each other and play off each other extremely well, and nothing feels out of place to his identity as a zoner or a strategic trapper. On paper, Digital Footprint is an ability that seems like it should be used as a sort of surprise tool that catches survivors off guard while trying to loop. A trap ability, so to speak. And don't get me wrong, this can certainly happen. However, because the traps are louder than a jet engine and can be heard from pretty far away, their utility isn't really to do direct damage. Although, if a survivor does step into one, and John Doe isn't on the other side of the map, you're basically fucked. Because of the slowness that survivors get, and the speed that John gets when a trap is triggered, if someone steps into a trap close by, you can basically just mow them down for free. That's not even including the free damage that they take from the trap itself. Survivors playing against John Doe should always be cautious, because stepping in a footprint is almost always a death sentence, either for you or the survivor that John is actively chasing. This isn't without counterplay though. As I said, the traps are very loud and can be heard from a million miles away, meaning survivors should realistically be able to react to and avoid them, unless they're really just blissfully unaware of their surroundings. Characters like 007N7 and Noob can also disable the traps with their abilities like the Clone and Slate Skin respectively to remove them and force John into a position where he has to replace them at little to no cost to themselves. The only thing with doing this is, although the survivors won't take direct damage, John still receives the 10-second speed boost when a trap is triggered by any means. So if an N7 sends a clone through a trap while another survivor is being chased, this can actually help John more than hurt him by letting him secure a kill with the extra speed. Even if no one is getting rid of the footprints, and even if survivors don't step into them, the main purpose that they serve is to completely shut down areas in the map and put survivors into positions where they are at a big disadvantage. Take this area of Pirate Bay for example. Some of the best footprint spots are right here, because this will shut down this entire corridor. No one can go in or out without some serious risk involved, and if John is chasing a survivor and manages to zone them to this part of the map, they either need their team to bail them out, they need to juke for their lives, or the killer needs to make a pretty severe mistake for the survivor to make it out of this situation alive. In my opinion, it's better to think of the digital footprints more like area denial tools that you can use to make survivors completely avoid strong areas and force them to play in areas that are better for you. You only get 3 of them, so every map does kind of have optimal places to leave them that shut down key loops or completely lock down a strong area. Sometimes the presence of a footprint is all that John Doe needs without a survivor ever even stepping into one. I personally also think it's fine that John doesn't get unstoppable if he gets stunned while putting down a footprint. The animation is pretty long, and he has to complete the whole animation anyway before he can even think about doing something as simple as moving. Plus, if a cheeky sentinel tries to run in to stun him while he's placing the footprint down, there's a good chance they'll end up activating the trap, so by the time John Doe is done with the animation of either placing the footprint or the stun, they'll just die anyway because of the aforementioned buffs and debuffs. Animation locks can be kind of funny in Forsaken too, because you can do some absolutely devious shit. Like if you catch Builderman in the middle of building a sentry, he can't cancel that animation, so you could just plop a footprint underneath him and he is absolutely done for with nothing he can do about it without his team coming to help him. Even then, the effects of the footprint are typically enough to still secure the kill. When it comes to John Doe's corrupt energy, or just the spikes as they're commonly called, I think this is by far one of the most interesting abilities to be added to an asymmetrical game. The idea of being able to create a wall to block someone's path is something that not a lot of game developers want to even try. Anything remotely related to terraforming is usually a bit too ambitious, I think, for a lot of games. I would say it's very likely because anything that manipulates the environment can be pretty buggy, glitchy, or game-breaking in some instances. Nothing like it exists in Dead by Daylight, and I think maybe that's why this character appealed to me so much. He's not your run-of-the-mill mobility killer. He's got an extremely unique power that takes a lot of strategic thinking to use. Not only can this lead to guaranteed kills in some cases, mostly in what I call the death corners, where John Doe can guarantee a full box on a careless survivor, but he can use these walls to completely zone survivors into a dead zone. or use them for direct damage, aka sniping. I really like the versatility that the spikes bring, and John is a very interesting character in the sense that there's not really just one correct way to play him. There's different playstyles, and some appeal to players more than others. There's just so much skill expression in all of them. There isn't much in Forsaken that's more satisfying than landing a full box on a survivor, knowing they are utterly trapped. I feel like John is a character that is completely unstoppable, no pun intended, when he is played perfectly. The tricky part is that he is incredibly difficult to play perfectly. He's heavily map dependent because some areas on some maps are completely impossible to fully spike, and it's more of a 50-50.
Looking at you, Planet Lost. Oh, how I loathe you.
But being able to cut a survivor off and fully trap them is insanely strong, albeit can be a little bit dependent on the survivor going into an area that's actually trappable. Smart survivors will simply play around areas that they know you can't spike them in. Usually this is somewhere around center map where there's not really any walls that you can trap them against, but this leads me into discussing John Doe's other major playstyle, which is sniping. Beloved by some, hated by others, this is definitely a bit of a divisive topic amongst John Doe players. Sniping means that John Doe uses his spikes as a damaging projectile, rather than a wall to cut survivors off, and to be totally honest, I think sniping is perfectly fine. Whether the devs intended for this to become a tactic for John Doe, I can't really say, but I think it's here to stay regardless. There have been some ideas thrown around to remove the ability to snipe, but I think removing part of John's versatility to make him more of a one-dimensional killer would be incredibly boring. Sniping makes John Doe a much more mechanically demanding killer, relying on predictions, reaction time, and a good understanding of spike distance to pull off well. Ideally, John Doe should be utilizing both sniping and trapping with his spikes to reach his full potential, and combining both tactics can make him a complete monster. I personally like using a combination in my own games, and don't really dedicate myself to using one or the other. Some situations are just better for trapping, some for sniping. I think sniping is also a good way to deal with certain survivors you don't necessarily want to get close to because of their abilities. Characters like Two Time and Guest 1337, since sniping them from a distance completely negates their ability to use their own kits to best you. They just kinda have to hope you miss your snipes or be ready to dodge the spikes. I think John's ability to spike flick using shift lock also creates a sort of depth in his gameplay. Since the spikes will go to wherever he's facing, you can start your trail of spikes facing away from your target, then use your shift lock to quickly snap your camera onto your target, planning ahead to calculate where the spikes will end up and go for a hit without accidentally creating a god loop that survivors can use to create distance on you. Which again means you have to use your noggin a little bit and be a little bit tactful in when and how you go for a snipe. This character is all about tact, and I personally enjoy that a lot. Playing John Doe makes me feel like I have to be smarter than the survivors, and landing a good use of my abilities is it's so gratifying. It may not be the same as landing a good walk speed override, void rush, or any other dash ability in any video game ever, but it's a completely different kind of skill expression. It's not mechanical demand, it's mental demand. I definitely gravitate towards characters that make me feel like I have to think rather than just react. I've never really clicked with characters that utilize mobility or fancy techs or play at a generally fast pace. I like to be methodical with my gameplay, and I think John Doe gives me that gratification. 404 Error might be just a wall hack ability, but giving John the ability to see survivors through walls synergizes extremely well with his spikes, especially where sniping is concerned. It gives him the ability to damage survivors from a great distance, which not every killer has the ability to do. 404 is also an ability that triggers the unstoppable passive, so this can lead to something that I think is pretty cool, and that is stun parrying. I think the most common and easiest 404 parry to pull off is against Guest 1337 in particular. Since John has such a slow M1, it makes it very easy for Guest to react block to basic attacks. but John can counter this counter by popping his 404 ability after an M1 connects with a guest block to parry the parry, so to speak. You can also use 404 to parry abilities like Shedletsky Slash, although this a little bit less so after the recent update that made Shed Slash a little bit less reactable, and Jane Doe's Hatchet, but I think in most cases it's better to just dodge those stuns instead. When it comes to guests specifically, you can try to block bait as well, but a half-decent guest will just wait for the audio cue and block on reaction. Being able to parry this with 404 means you'll still eat the stun, sure, but as long as guest doesn't miss the parry punch, you'll have a reduced stun duration, get a speed boost, and your ability will be off cooldown quicker. It gives what is an otherwise simple ability a little bit more depth and utility, which is pretty cool in my opinion. I may be biased, and I have zero shame in that fact, but I think John Doe is the best designed killer in any asymmetrical game that I have personally ever played. Everything about his gameplay is unique and flows together super nicely. I also think if we're talking about skill expression, he has so much of it, even if it's not a flashy or clippable character for the most part. I think that his skill floor, or the most basic of basic requirements, is low enough for him to be accessible for new or casual players. Those who just want to pick him up and play him without sinking a whole lot of time and just to be able to keep up with semi-competent lobbies. I don't think this makes him easy, not by any stretch of the word. It just means that he's more easily digestible for a more casual or newer player to just load in and understand. Easy to pick up and play, hard to master, so to speak. Now, as you get more experienced and practiced, working your way up towards the skill ceiling, or absolute character mastery, that's where things get interesting. This is when decision-making, stamina management, and getting the absolute most value out of your abilities begins to matter much more. He's one of the most difficult killers in the game because of how much knowledge you need on things like maps, survivor ability timings, being able to work around John's slow and heavy movements, but once you start to get a grasp on him, he becomes extremely strong, even a little bit oppressive in the right hands. I love characters that are simple but reward skill and effort the more time you put into them. Characters that are worth the time sink. John Doe's skill ceiling feels like it could very well be infinite with the way players can be creative with their use of spikes. The only limit is your own creativity. He is a character that also hits very hard. Everything he does is just high damage output. His M1 does a ton of damage, his digital footprints cause damage, his spikes can take almost an entire half of a health bar if they all land, his trail does damage, and if you manage to combo an M1 with the trail damage by forcing a survivor to step into it, they take over 30 points of damage on one hit. The trade-off is that everything he does is extremely slow and telegraphed, which I think makes him a very difficult killer to play, but also balanced. Because of the fact that everything he does is slow, readable, and reactable, you have to be extremely decisive with what you're doing, and all of your decisions have to matter. But if he does play well and land those hits on you, your health is just gone. He really does present as kind of a brute, but John wasn't always this big, heavy-hitting, hulking monster. With all of that gameplay discussion out of the way, I'd like to talk to you about John Doe's lore, one of my favorites in all of video games. In life, John Doe was a simple and maybe sort of a plain man. He worked a normal office job at Roblox headquarters looking for and testing faulty code, presumably under the instruction and employment of Builderman, and also worked alongside his wife, Jane Doe, who mostly specialized in fieldwork and focus investigations. John has been described by his wife as a sweet and caring individual that saw the best in those around him and everyone and everything. That he was a harmless and gentle person that would never so much as harm a fly. John and Jane were polar opposites of each other, but seemed to have a very loving and healthy marriage, caring deeply for one another, with Jane being very driven and ambitious about her work and being somewhat reclusive and antisocial. mostly keeping to herself, and John being supportive of her goals but encouraging her to be more outgoing and social, as he was much more of a people person and enjoyed socializing. If you asked John, he would happily tell you that Jane was the best thing that ever happened to him. What would happen to them would end up being a tragedy. There are different iterations of what exactly happened to John Doe and different theories that have been presented. The exact events are not so clear, and there's not really been an official timeline of what transpired. So much of this is just going off of what information the developers have shown and confirmed, and what I could piece together from the wiki description and the little bits of in-game lore that are currently available. But John Doe, while working and looking for faulty code, came into contact with a bit of corrupted code, which is described as being like a parasitic fungus that latches onto its host. The corruption that came into contact with John was given a little bit more lore on the newest map that was added with the Azure update, being the Roblox HQ map. This is the office where John and Jane worked, with it being completely destroyed and taken over by the corruption, even infecting those who touched the hazardous wreckage with corruption without John Doe even being the killer in play. The corruption is a fungus in the sense that it is alive. It breathes and takes from its host all of their memories and their body. Once it consumes enough of them, it sort of grows its own consciousness and will continue to try and grow and spread. John was a perfect candidate to be infected by this fungus because of his personality. He was described as being very low-key, with a personal lack of ambition and a carefree nature. The parasite latched onto John as the perfect host. How exactly he came to be infected wasn't explicitly clear. Maybe he was working on a faulty bit of code and happened to touch it when he wasn't supposed to. A horrible accident that would cost him the ultimate price. Maybe it was caused by some malicious intervention from the Spectre in some manner, that it was behind the creation of the parasitic corruption, not seeking John out in particular, but looking for a host by means of this fungus that was infecting the Roblox code. Regardless of how it happened, it happened. Once the corruption took over John's body, it mutated it in a way that turned him into a vicious monster, a shell of the person that he was. It would push his spine out of his torso, breaking his bones through the skin and exposing them while also held in place with the black fungal substance. His right arm would turn into a weapon, completely consumed by the corruption, too heavy for him to lift, but strong and sharp enough to impale another's body. The right side of his face would be completely taken over by corruption. I always sort of thought if John Doe was translated into a more realistic art style, he'd be fucking terrifying. I feel like he'd really lean into something like body horror and would just be super gross and disgusting looking, with the corruption affecting and spreading through his body. Not just John Doe's body would be altered, but his very mind. All of his memories of his life before would be taken from him by the virus, including memories of his wife Jane. The only thing that remains of John Doe is what's left of his body, a silhouette of what once was, meaning that although he still looks like John, it's not him anymore, completely overtaken by the parasite. All that's left is residue. Even through John Doe's milestones, we see him looking more and more unrecognizable as the parasite takes over and mutates his body more and more, becoming more of the fungus than himself. John would have a permanent smile on his face as the corruption acts to revert his body into a default dummy state, which basically means turning him into nothing more than an empty vessel without a personality or mind of his own anymore. After the corruption takes place, John would disappear on March 18th, leaving no trace of where he went or what happened to him. This is presumably when he was forsaken and taken by the Spectre, who uses his mindless aggression to serve its own purposes. John Doe's lore is something that I would absolutely kill to have more of. I would love to see a fully in-depth telling of the story by the developers. I do know they mentioned in their official Discord that there will be more lore coming through extra voice lines with Jane, but whether this means more John Doe lore tidbits or not, we'll just have to see. I do wish that there was a more detailed explanation or timeline of events, and from what I've gathered, there are different versions, ideas, and headcanons floating around. I remember seeing one that detailed John possibly brushing up against the fungus or corruption completely on accident while walking through a closed off server room, having just a small spot on his arm and progressively getting more and more sick. So, this iteration means that the infection took time to infect him and wasn't just an instant infection, it was more like a sickness that continued to progress and progress. Imagine that version being fully fleshed out, and how horribly sad it would be. Just a man trying to do his job when he gets infected with some horrible corruption, maybe even not realizing that he was infected at all, at least not right away, like a tick or a leech latching onto its host without their knowledge. Imagine John starting to become more and more ill, maybe over the course of a few days, starting to exhibit flu-like symptoms of fever, nausea, dizziness, becoming so sick he can barely get out of bed. Then the behavioral changes start to happen. He becomes forgetful, his cognitive function starts to decline, and the worse it progressively gets, the more the aggression starts to set in. Losing his temper, lashing out, and not knowing why, and being powerless to stop it. Jane trying desperately to help her husband overcome this mysterious sickness only to have to stand by and watch his decline, and being completely powerless to stop it or fix it. I think this also leans into the whole zombie theme that he has going on a little bit more, which would be an interesting take on the story. I think it would be a pretty interesting detail if John had some level of consciousness after the corruption completely took over. His mind and body are definitely gone, but what if there was a part of his brain that was still himself, trapped inside and being forced to watch himself commit these violent acts against somewhat innocent people, including his own wife that he adored? I know the lore also states that Jane still wants to fix John despite the fact that removing the corruption would kill him. Everyone seems powerless in this situation. Sort of how in The Last of Us, there was a bit of a small detail that those in the early stages of infection were still cognizant of their situation. They were fully aware of themselves killing and consuming other humans. You can even hear their cries of agony mixed in with the normal zombie growling. Pretty chilling detail, but it definitely got me thinking, what if that were John Doe? The facts of John and Jane's actual story is one that immediately pulled me in. As my partner has pointed out to me, I really am drawn to characters that have suffered immensely. His story is not really anything new. There have been many stories across all different medias of normal, ordinary people who have been transformed into vicious monsters against their will. But I love how Forsaken has handled John Doe and his story. It's a tragic tale of someone who was nothing more than a victim of circumstance, and ultimately he did not deserve the fate that awaited him after being corrupted. And of course, you can't talk about John Doe really without also discussing Jane Doe in tandem. And I have heard some theories based on this particular statement on the Chris Sagan trivia tidbits that Jane Doe's drive for answers can sometimes cause moral dilemma. This is so ominous to me because it's reading like she may have been somewhat responsible for what happened to John, that she blames herself for what happened. I don't think in a malicious way. She obviously cares about her husband. Even after being brought into Forsaken, she still wants to fix what happened to him and to everyone. So maybe some accident that she was involved in that led to John's corruption indirectly. We also know that Jane has a very clear and obvious disdain for Builderman, calling him lazy, placing the blame on him for what's happened. I think it's pretty heavily implied that Builderman knew something about the corruption and just did nothing about it. His negligence caused a good person to become a victim of untold suffering. Not just John, but Jane and everyone that John Doe hurts after the fact. In Azure's video, I talked about how it seems like these stories have deeper meanings hidden underneath them. I think if I were to read into John's story between the lines, it's a warning of things like corporate greed, corrupt CEOs causing the suffering of those underneath them by simply not caring about the people they employ, a trickle-down effect of the system harming those who are just trying to get by and live their lives. Those who just go to work, collect their earnings, and are just trying to thrive and survive. Innocent bystanders and just regular, average people who are harmed by the actions or lack thereof of the people above them. Those in power who actually have the ability to make decisions. It's just a horrible tragedy, and it tells a tale of the victims that could realistically be anyone. It could be you, it could be me, it could be anyone under any sort of government or leadership figure. I have heard some theories that John's corruption could also be an analogy for domestic violence, and that the corruption making him more aggressive could be a sort of reflection of an abuser losing themselves to their anger, that Jane was a victim of abuse at the hands of her husband, and I've also seen some headcanons that John Doe was a raging alcoholic in life, but honestly, I don't buy into that theory, not one bit. It is an interesting theory to explore, but I don't think it's realistic to imply that John was an abusive piece of garbage. It's been said multiple times that he loved and cared about his wife, so I'm gonna say cool theory, but very unlikely and not the theme that they were going for. I think that theory also really rubs me the wrong way. I won't go heavy into details on this one. I had a whole rant typed out about why I disagreed with this theory and why I think it's a pretty bad example and how I think it's actually kind of a spit in the face to people that have been through abusive situations, but I'm just going to omit that. Just know that I 100% do not buy into that theory, and I actually kind of detest it. John Doe doesn't remember anything of who he was. He's a relentless monster that you can hardly call human at this point. But the Spectre still takes great care to make sure that there is no chance of John repenting and gaining his memories back, if that's even a remote possibility. It hides Jane Doe's face from him in the games, and even in their unique Last Man Standing cards, it hides Jane's face. She must have been very important to John if the Spectre is taking such precautions, and it taunts Jane from her point of view on their Last Man Standing. It shows her John when he was still somewhat normal, maybe the earliest stages of his corruption. You're one and only, it tells her, mocking her that the most important person to her can't be saved and she has to face what he's become. Their story is such a sad story, and the fact that John was completely powerless to stop what happened to him is just heartbreaking. Imagine seeing the person you care about the most reduced to a mindless abomination that will kill you without a second thought. It's something that even Jane struggles with. Her kill animation with John shows her actually being very close to besting him in the altercation, knocking him down, and when she's ready to take the final blow on him, she hesitates, stopping her hatchet mid-swing, which ultimately leads to John regaining control of the fight and killing her. Thanks, devs, for ripping my heart out with that one. More, please. I really like when characters make me feel strong feelings. There are also some other Easter eggs between John and Jane Doe, like how when Jane takes a hit specifically from John Doe, she actually makes a different pained expression rather than just the typical grimace that she shows when she's hurt by any other killer. One that looks more like she's holding back tears rather than just in pain. There's also the fact that her hatchet only does 10 damage to John Doe when she stuns him, as opposed to the standard 25 points of damage that every other killer gets hit with. Almost like she's holding back only because it is John specifically. I feel like this story reminds me a lot of Resident Evil 7 and the horrible tragedy of what happened to the Baker family. While they are the main antagonists for that game, they were ultimately victims themselves, victims of the bioweapon created by Umbrella Corporation. You can even see in the DLC for the game that the Bakers were kind and caring people willing to go out of their way to help others. As Jack Baker carries the child known as Evelyn into their home to help her after the ship carrying her crashed onto their property, completely unknowing that Evelyn was a weapon of mass destruction. All they wanted to do was help these people who washed up on their doorstep. And they became victims. But they didn't just die. They were turned into monsters by the mold that Evelyn spread. The whole family lost their minds, and Jack Baker was the most aggressive of them all. However, there is a cutscene of Jack talking to Ethan, the protagonist and playable main character, where he speaks to him as himself and not the mold-infested monster he has become, asking Ethan to save his family.
Ethan? Hey, shh, I know. I'm not gonna hurt you. Hell, I never would have if I could have helped you.
What do you mean?
I'm no killer, son. Neither is Marguerite. So no more
What
than
is she? No, what did she do to you?
She infected us with her gift. That's what she calls it. I found her near a busted out tank in the bayou. Not exactly, son. She just... She forces her way into your mind, your soul. You can't fight back. You are connected to her, and you can't resist the urge to... Listen, the girl just wants a family of her own. She's the key, all right? You find her, and you stop her. Ethan, free my family. Please.
It's one of the most heart-wrenching scenes in media, in my opinion, and I think is very comparable to John and Jane's story. I don't know if there's any hope for John Doe, if there's any bit of his humanity left, or if the parasite has consumed every bit of what remains of him. There is also a little bit of text stating that the parasite is the only thing keeping John alive and functional at this point, and removing it would cause his death. It's like a twist on some sort of zombie virus that is so common in pop culture nowadays. This story is one of my favorites because of how beautifully tragic it all is, that Jane cared so much about her husband that she actually made her own way into the realm of the Spectre searching for him. She was not taken like the other survivors. She ended up in a sort of scrapyard full of rotting remnants of the game and began documenting everything that she could find. Eventually, the Spectre would notice her presence and would scatter her documents and her wedding ring out into various parts of its domain. Collecting these items is how you obtain Jane as a playable survivor, by finding them within the games and bringing them back to her. She now resides in the basement with her documents and research, presumably trying to find a way to save everyone that's been forsaken. I hope we get more details to their story in future updates, because I absolutely adore both of these characters. There's just something about unwilling victims like John that I have such a soft spot for. It's like watching a train wreck happen in front of your eyes. It's horrible and tragic, but you can't quite look away. The origins of John Doe are not quite so sad. John Doe didn't originate from Forsaken. He is actually a very, very old myth that came up in some of the earliest days of the Roblox platform. You see, John Doe was an account that was created all the way back in 2005, one of the very first in existence. The John Doe account was discovered by the Roblox community, and mass hysteria ensued. All sorts of rumors started to spread about this mysterious account, and John Doe is a name that's oftentimes used during criminal investigations or situations where people need to remain anonymous. Same thing with Jane Doe. They are placeholder names, and the main reason that people thought that this account was a hacker or associated with a hacker is because it appeared on the friends list of actual hackers on Roblox. YouTubers started to use this as clickbait, starting to spread rumors that this John Doe account would break Roblox on March 18th, 2017. And this rumor would spread like wildfire, as these YouTubers mostly targeted audience of younger, gullible children. It got so out of hand that Roblox themselves had to step in to debunk the myth, as everyone was fully expecting something to actually happen on March 18th. And Roblox would make an official statement explaining that the John and Jane Doe accounts were early testing accounts when Roblox was in its earlier stages of development. That there was no hacker named John Doe and nothing will happen on that date. The original post has unfortunately been deleted, but here's a Twitter post from March 21st, 2017 that references the blog post that Roblox made. This wasn't the end for John Doe, though. Although the myth was busted, John became a sort of iconic character in Roblox history because of this hoax, and it's why he's shown up in many games outside of Forsaken. It's like the Roblox equivalent of Herobrine from Minecraft, and honestly, if you were a young kid playing Roblox around the time and saw all this going on, you would probably be pretty scared, especially with how widespread the rumor ended up being. It's a pretty cool little bit of history. It's even something that Forsaken honors as an iconic time. March 18th has definitively just kind of become John Doe Day, and on that date every year, John Doe gets what is supposed to be a big buff, and it's supposed to make him kind of a force to be reckoned with, but I'll keep my opinions about March 18th John Doe to myself. I don't really care for the changes, but it's still cool that the developers just give these characters with a date of significance, a day to be the star of the show, and do something creative with their powers. It's a really fun idea, and I'm glad they do it for both John and Slasher on March 18th and Friday the 13th, respectively. The original John Doe myth almost reminds me of something like a creepypasta or a folktale. I've said it before, but I grew up being kind of the weird kid. I liked bugs, snakes, monsters, and creepy shit. I grew up on media like Tim Burton movies, scary books. I loved ghost stories and watching paranormal shows, even though they were probably fake, let's be honest. But I was fascinated not with the whole ghost behavior caught on camera itself, but the history of the places being investigated, the tragedies that actually happened in those places. I also really liked creepypastas when I was younger, things like The Rake, the Russian sleep experiment, and so on and so forth, so it's no wonder that the myth of John Doe in Roblox is pretty cool to me. I also love that it's turned him into this mascot, a notable figure that many games have included with their own portrayals of him. Other games like Doom by Fate have implemented their own version of John Doe as a playable character that is slightly different from Forsaken's version of him. Forsaken's version of John Doe is definitely my favorite, not that I'm biased or anything, but like I said before, the whole idea of a map manipulation killer is so unique and interesting. In Doom by Fate, John Doe plays like a complete brute with a charge ability and a kind of command grab where you can throw survivors. He still has his classic scary spikes, but they aren't necessarily used like a wall to box survivors in. They're more like a damaging projectile in Doom by Fate. Another game that John Doe shows up in is Timeless, which it's not out yet, but I did play the early test for it, and I am so excited for this game. John Doe, or just Mr. Doe as he's called in this iteration, is very similar to Doom by Fate John. He has a charge that pins survivors to walls, he has a grab ability that implants a bomb into survivors that can be spread to other survivors and causes damage when detonated. He has a leap ability that throws him high up in the air, and if he lands on a survivor when he comes back down, they kind of ragdoll. He's a lot of fun in that game. He also still has an identity as a trapper with these traps that he can leave around the map that will hold the survivor in place, leading to some pretty funny interactions where you can just ram into the survivors with the charge or grab them with the implant ability while they're stuck. The gameplay I'm showing is a video that the devs have put out to showcase updated gameplay, as Timeless is very close to releasing pretty soon from what they've been updating, and I will absolutely be playing the hell out of this game because I love it to bits and I miss it all the time. Now, getting back into Forsaken, with Azure's video, I brought up an example of a real cult, and I wanted to do something similar with John Doe. However, a man turning into a monster is a little bit difficult to find a real life comparison for, but I do have some things that I can bring up. John is described as losing himself, a gentle person becoming aggressive and violent, ripping apart anything in his path, spreading corruption wherever he goes. Corruption could also be a stand-in for a disease, for example. I don't know if I've talked about my actual real-life job very much on this channel, and I won't say too much as I don't want to dox myself or publish my place of work, but I do work in animal welfare. Specifically, I work for an animal shelter. There is something that is taken so seriously in my line of work that outwardly healthy animals can be euthanized or put to sleep just for a suspicion of being exposed to it. Something so terrifying when you really look into it that movies and horror stories have been created about it. And I'm talking about the rabies virus. The rabies virus is a viral disease that attacks the central nervous system of its victims. It is the closest thing I believe our world actually has to a real-life zombie virus. Rabies is the reason that bats are often villainized because they are an extremely common carrier of the virus. Rabies is the reason movies and books like Cujo exist. Cujo being a famous large dog in media that was infected with the virus and went on a murderous rampage after being bitten by an infected bat. And the behavior, while of course exaggerated for shock value, is not too terribly inaccurate. The most common symptoms of rabies, at least in humans, is confusion, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, and just in general bizarre behavior. In animals, it can present as uncharacteristic aggression, loss of muscle coordination. Normally shy animals that avoid people, such as coyotes, will lose all fear, as they're not neurologically sound at that point. They may bite or snap at nothing, the air in front of them, and a common symptom in both humans and animals that is associated with the virus is called hydrophobia, or a fear of water. This doesn't mean an actual fear of water, but infected and symptomatic individuals become very avoidant of water, unable to drink and unable to swallow due to involuntary muscle spasms around the throat. It makes drinking water physically painful, and thus creates a fear and aversion to water in individuals that are also in the process of losing their minds. And the scariest part is, once symptoms of the disease show themselves, it's already progressed past the point of no return. The disease has no cure and is 100% fatal. There is a reason that the term rabid is often used as a synonym for angry. Rabies is fucking scary. Animals that bite humans, no matter the circumstances, have to undergo a mandatory quarantine in a facility like my job, where they are kept under lock and key and observed daily for symptoms of the virus. Any suspicion of a positive case means that animal now has to be tested. And the only way to test for rabies is to take a sample of the brain, which you cannot do while the animal is still alive. This is why it's so important to maintain pet vaccinations. There's no cure for this virus. You can only be preventative before it happens. Rabies is horrible. It's scary. It's why people need to remain cautious around wildlife, because we can admire and respect it, but from a safe distance. Rabies has become much less common in household pets like our cats and dogs, and is much more likely to infect wildlife that can't be protected against it. It's most common in animals like bats, foxes, raccoons, and skunks. I have never seen a pet cat or dog show symptoms or test positive at my own job, luckily, though quarantined animals are always treated with the utmost caution. While positive cases of rabies are quite rare in humans, science has progressed to a point where someone who is diligent and receives medical care immediately after being bitten by an animal will have a very good chance of survival after a course of vaccinations. It wasn't always this way, and there are still some cases that can beat the odds and slip through the cracks. I'm going to read an excerpt of a more recent story. This story was published on the website of the Fox News Network about a Minnesota man who passed away from the virus very recently, just in 2021. An 84-year-old man with other severe underlying medical issues, which was the main contributor as to why he passed away, not necessarily just from the virus itself, but because he had all of these other underlying issues, such as coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and chronic kidney disease, woke up on July 27th, 2020, while a bat was biting his right hand. It had presumably gotten into his bedroom. He didn't see any bite marks, but washed his hands with soap and water after the bite. The man captured the bat and presented it immediately for testing. The bat did test positive for rabies, and after that, the patient immediately sought and was administered appropriate care, which included rabies post-exposure prophylaxis, the course of vaccinations. About 5 months after the exposure, the patient started to have severe pain on the right side of his face with excessive right eye tearing. His symptoms progressed to facial numbness, trouble swallowing, and right arm numbness associated with nausea and vomiting. After same-day emergency room visits for progressive symptoms, he was hospitalized approximately a week after first developing symptoms when he complained of worsening facial pain and difficulty swallowing. Upon a medical workup, a lumbar puncture revealed concern for inflammation of the brain due to a virus, but he subsequently died 15 days after developing symptoms of rabies. The team had also found out that he had an undiagnosed immune deficiency, likely a contributor in why he had passed away. The CDC confirmed he met laboratory criteria for rabies, including rabies virus in his saliva and anti-rabies antibodies in his spinal fluid, and the genetic sequences of the rabies virus from both the patient and the bat that bit him were identical. Now that we've gotten past the heavy real-life example, we can get back into John Doe. I feel like the rabies virus is something that could be comparable to John Doe's corruption. The symptoms are very similar. It makes you unnaturally aggressive. It's an incurable, fatal infection. It makes you act like not yourself. While one is a fictional parasite that makes someone superhuman, and the other is a deadly disease that actually impacts a number of humans every year and thousands of innocent and defenseless animals, I think the similarities are definitely there, and both of them are an uncomfortable reality. Another example I figured I could bring up is the Cordyceps fungi, which you may recognize from the video game series turned television show The Last of Us. While the fungus in the show is definitely an exaggerated example, Cordyceps really does exist, and it is a sort of zombie fungus, but mostly where insects are concerned. It is a parasitic fungus that will infect an insect, such as an ant, and cause it to behave strangely in a way it will sort of control the ant. It will cause it to climb up somewhere high and force the ant's jaw into a death grip where it bites down and won't let go on the stalk of a plant, for example. The ant will die in this position, and the fungus will sprout from the ant's remains, spreading its spores to reproduce. The fungus is completely harmless to humans, despite how it's portrayed in The Last of Us, and actually has some medicinal healing properties, which include acting as a natural antioxidant and also being good and beneficial for the kidneys. It's no danger to us, but as fiction has shown, if it were dangerous to people, how terrifying and potentially catastrophic it could be. I think this is also a fair comparison to John Doe's corruption, as it is described as being a sort of fungus, and seems to function in a similar manner to the Cordyceps. It attaches to its host, making the host behave erratically and strangely, and ultimately leads to their death so it can continue to spread. John Doe has some pretty great cosmetics, some of my favorite in the game. His milestones are interesting in that they tell you the story of his corruption. They show his affliction progressing more and more until it completely takes him over. His final stages have him in a sort of tuxedo outfit with his skin completely pale, Presumably, he is very fully much dead in this skin, and I know some people read this as being his wedding attire, which does make sense as Jane Doe's Milestone 4 also has her in a dress that very much resembles a wedding dress. However, given the circumstances, I personally take it to mean that Milestone 4 is John's funeral, a tuxedo to show that he is fully too far gone at this point, and the corruption is now all that he is. John Doe is no more. I've also talked a lot about why I like Gash Harpoon, which is definitely my favorite skin in the game, despite not being the biggest Limbus Company fan. It's a great game with great world building and amazing characters, but the gameplay itself is just not for me. The music in this skin is just incredible though. Curiosity is one of the few songs from Forsaken that has made its way to my personal playlist and that I just listen to in my free time. Remix of an existing song or not, this song bangs, this skin bangs, it's absolutely top notch, and the voice lines are also wonderful. I also like that this skin is more loosely based on the character of Ahab versus being an outright lookalike, and the pirate attire being super over the top is just super great. I love it, and I will never stop loving it. John Doe does have a skin based on the hillbilly from Dead by Daylight, and you'd probably think that I would like this skin because of how much history I have with DBD, but I really just don't. I get what they were going for with the mutated face, but something about this skin just doesn't click with me. Maybe it's the color palette, or maybe just because I'm not a huge fan of hillbilly either. I don't know. It's not my favorite, and it's not really my cup of tea. But because it's Dead by Daylight inspired, I thought it was worth mentioning at the very least, because I still appreciate that it's there. I'm not going to comment too much on Treachstone, I know, because I don't have it unlocked. It's a cool skin though. The black and blue colors contrast super nicely. I love the animations that he has for things like placing a footprint and the way that the wings are animated while he's performing certain actions. I also really like the terror radius in particular before the chase theme itself. It just sounds so ominous and foreboding. John's music in general is pretty cool. I like the default a lot more than I like some other killer's default chase theme, and the more heavy metal remix that he gets for his Milestones 3 and 4 are just superb. I'm a really big fan of it, although I personally like his Legacy Milestones much more than the current Milestones. I unfortunately started playing the game too late in its life to obtain them. He has many amazing skins and a lot of really incredible backing music. Forsaken's soundtrack is amazing, and it's one of my favorite parts of the game as a whole. I previously had talked about You and I, John's unique Last Man Standing theme with his wife Jane, and honestly, it has to be one of my favorite tracks. I know a lot of people don't like it because it's much more mellow and less energetic than a lot of the LMS tracks out there, plus a little bit more melancholy in its tone, but I really appreciate that detail. I think it's a really good contrast between John and Jane, with the softer acoustic strings clashing with the more crunchy electric guitar strings to represent each character respectively. I really like this track and how emotional it sounds. It sounds like a sad love song. As for John Doe's actual sound design, I don't have too much to comment on. It sounds fitting for him. Everything sounds super heavy and gives this feeling of weight and danger. His footsteps are loud, his breathing is super loud and raspy. The man literally sounds like he's fucking dying. If you listen to it isolated, it's actually pretty unsettling, almost demonic in nature. Very nice touch. It really leans into the idea of him being this dying beast of a man. Alright, so this video was definitely something I was looking forward to working on, and I'm glad it's finally done. John is a character that I think I'll always love as my first real main in this game, and I wish there was more like him. He just brings so much unique gameplay that requires out-of-the-box thinking, strategy, and planning ahead. His skill sets are something you don't typically see in most popular characters, and I really appreciate that. I love his gameplay identity, and I think I'd be really crushed if it were ever changed. If there's more characters that you'd like to see a deep dive style video on, let me know in the comments below. I'm super grateful for all the support, for every view, comment, sub, Discord join. It all means a lot to me. This channel has grown so much faster than I ever thought it would, and I hope I don't disappoint. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. And again, most of the information I'm citing will be from the... It's definitely been a huge help for these kinds of projects, and generally it's just really fun. Then what happened? Straight into the discussion. Those being corrupt energy and 404 error. Whenever John Doe is stunned out of two very specific, which we'll get into here in a little bit, if this ability starts exhibiting... What the fuck?